You feel this call that the Lord has placed on your life. You answer this call, you go. You get there. Is there this feeling of like, okay, what now? Like, I know what the Lord is calling me to, but how do I even start doing that?
Yeah. No, 100%.
All right. Welcome back, WorldLink friends and family. We're so excited to have you listening in and joining us for this podcast. Today is going to be kind of just chatting.
Yes.
We don't have a lot of practical tips. I mean, he might have some wisdom in store that I don't know about. But today we just want to give you kind of a peek into the mission field. I'm just going to ask Manny some questions about the history of his experience as a missionary, how he's seen church planting and discipleship and all these great things that we've talked about played out in his own life. And so I'm excited to get a little bit more of the backstory. I feel like I've gotten bits and pieces from working alongside of you, but I'm excited to hear kind of the whole picture of it.
Yeah. I'm pumped. Yeah. So fire away. What you got?
All right. So first, just give us a little bit of insight into where did you go? Why did you feel called there? Give us the picture of how you got started as a missionary.
Yeah. So I grew up as a missionary kid. So my parents were missionaries. They went to the field back in 1985. And so I had I had my childhood and high school in Spain. So I graduated and then I came back to the States. And as I was just weighing the options about what I was going to do and praying and asking for the Lord to give me direction through college and after, I really felt like the Lord was leading back into missions. And then there was the question of, well, where was I going to go? But I felt like for me, there was just such a burden for Spain still, because there's so many people there that hadn't heard the gospel. But then also the fact that I knew Spanish and the fact that I knew the culture and that it was familiar to me, I thought this would be really a great foundation to build on. And so there was a thing of like, well, do your own thing, go and figure out your own mission. But then I thought that would be I'd waste a lot of time learning another language, learning another culture. And I already I knew a lot about Spain. So it allowed me to be more effective, quicker going back to Spain. So, so I prayed with my wife and we spent some time in that, and the Lord led us back to Spain, and we were there for about 5 years. So
I feel like a lot of people, a challenge or a hindrance that they see in missions is there's an idea out there that it's a lot easier to be a missionary if you're single, and you're not having to bring another person into that. Do you feel like you saw that played out in your own life?
Yeah, I mean, Paul talks about that as well. He's like, listen, it is easier because you don't have to worry about someone else. You're just following the Lord. It is easier to be in ministry if you can do that. But then he also says, he's like, well, if you can't do that and you really need to get married, then get married. But it will always be more difficult to go with it, or it can be anyway, I think, because you have other things like, we got to cultivate our marriage. But I don't have to cultivate my marriage. If I'm a single guy, I can just completely focus on the mission. So when we went over, there were challenges because my wife didn't know Spanish at first, and she didn't know Spain. And there were a lot of challenges that we had and that we had to overcome because she spent some time to learn the language and to learn how to live in Spain when she had lived all her life in the States. So, I think it's definitely a factor. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just a factor. So.
Yeah. Outside of, I know there are a lot of things that you kind of had a good foundation with going in since you had lived in Spain already and you knew the language and that kind of stuff. So a lot of those challenges that we've talked about with sending were lessened for you, but what were some challenges that you still saw played out?
Yeah. I think, uh, well, we even though I don't, when I speak in Spanish, I generally I don't have an accent. And so a lot of people didn't know that I was American until they got to know me a little bit better. But there is a thing that happens when people realize you're not one of them. So even though I was able to lessen that significantly, like if I'm sharing the gospel with someone, for the most part, they would think I was Spaniard because I always spoke. But but then if there was some sort of knowledge of now, oh, you're American, you're not Spaniard, then there would be a minor wall that could go up. And so it didn't always happen, but it could be something that would happen. So that was one of the barriers that we saw. Also, I mean, we had a defined timeline for us to be overseas because the desire was for us to come back and to be able to help build up the organization that was sending us on the field. So that was so we had kind of a defined timeline. We knew that we were leaving at some point, and so that created a challenge. The fact that it's not our home, and we know at some point we're going to come back to the States, that that changes the way that you're doing, the way that we did church and the way that we were planting our church. We were thinking, well, we at some point we're going to leave. We're not going to be here for 40 years in this church, cultivating this church that we're planting. So those are challenges that arose along the way.
So when you step into missions, you feel this call that the Lord has placed on your life. You answer this call, you go. You get there. Is there this feeling of like, okay, what now? Like, I know what the Lord is calling me to, but how do I even start doing that?
Yeah. 100%. That's what happened with me. So we got there and we began working with the people who were already on the ground and began asking questions, began learning, and we kind of helped to define our role as we were there. And even though I've heard with some other organizations, they might be a little bit more prepared going in, or maybe they have a little bit more of a defined role. There's a lot of things that happen on the mission field that you're just not ready for. Like in Spain, things just take longer. It just, if you want to get a driver's license, it takes you months to get a driver's license. If you want to buy a car, you can walk into a dealership with the cash in hand. You're still not going to get the car for about 3 weeks. So
Wow.
I mean, those were frustrating things. And we've had people come from Spain to here, and they're like, I can't believe everything I got done in an afternoon. They were like, it would have taken me a month in Spain. So there's cultural and I guess cultural dynamics that cause things to just work differently, and that requires that you have to think differently about your role and what would be the best way to meet people's needs in different countries. So,
Gotcha. So you went in knowing that you were going to try and plant a church there.
No, we didn't. We actually went just to work at the seminary and help with the church planters that were going to the seminary. We were going to help with equipping and get involved with some of their church plants. But then over the course of about a year and a half, felt the Lord laying it on our heart to start a church there in Madrid in an area that didn't have a church. And so we actually prayed we wanted to make sure if we started a church in Spain, that we had a Spanish couple that was going to be with us starting that
That's awesome.
and helping to lead it. And so we prayed for about 6 or 7 months for the Lord to bring us the right couple. We asked a couple couples, but they both were like, no, this is not where we feel the Lord is leading us. And then we finally found a couple that decided to join with us, and we launched. So,
gotcha. How long were you guys there total?
We were there for 5 years.
Okay.
So, and so the church was in place for about 3 years before we left, and we left it in the hands of local Spaniards. So.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
just share a couple of stories that stick out to you, stories of transformation or
Yeah.
stories that impacted you personally, just some of your favorite testimonies from that time.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite memories was revolved around what we did with the church. We would the church planter and I, his name was Danny, and his wife Carol and my wife Jamie. So sometimes we would all four go out and share the gospel. Sometimes it was just me and Danny going out. But we got to meet people over time in this town where we were starting this church. And when we started the church initially, we had marketed, we had told people about what we were doing and all that. The first day that we launched our church there in Madrid, we had 6 people. No, we had 5 people at our church. We had one of the girls from the seminary, and then me and my wife, and Danny and his wife. So nobody came, and so we were a little bit discouraged about that. But then we got a call later that day from a lady in that neighborhood who was like, "Hey, I got your flyer. I wasn't able to go to church today, but I'd like to come." And we were just overjoyed. We were like, "Oh, this is awesome! Now we're 6." And and then there was another family that decided to come in, and that was, people just kept on trickling in, and slowly our church began to grow, and we got up, I think at our height we were at about 45 people.
Wow.
Which is a big deal in Spain. It takes a long time to get that. The average size church in Spain is about 80 people. And so, we knew of other churches that had been going for decades and they had 70, 80 people. And so we were seeing people come to Christ, and we were trying different things all the time. How do we share the gospel in a more creative way? And I mean, I love soccer, and Spain, everybody knows about. I mean, everybody knows. The grandmothers know about soccer. They know about the soccer players. They're all like, everybody knows about soccer. And so one of the things that we did was we'd put on the soccer tournament, and because Danny and I would go and play soccer with kids in that neighborhood, and so we got to know a lot of people, and we were like, we should do a tournament. And we got to know, there was also a guy named Danny. So this is another guy named Danny, but he was
different Danny.
Yeah, there's a lot of Dannys in Spain, but this second Danny was a leader of a gang, and we would play soccer with this gang and all the other kids in that area. There was one time we were in the middle of a game when the police showed up.
Oh, wow.
And they lined up the gang on the wall. They're all, they have their hands against the wall, and they're checking them for drugs and all that. And they confiscated. And I was like, I turned to my church planter, Danny friend, and I was like, what do we do? And he's like, we're okay. We don't have drugs. So he's like, we don't do anything. We just, let's just wait. And so we waited. The cops they just took the stuff and then they left. And then we just went back to playing soccer. So anyway, but along this, and this kind of goes back to the discipleship piece along the way. So we would play like King of the Court, and you'd have like 4 or 5 teams. And the team that lost after 2 goals, they sit out, and another team comes in. And you just have this constant rotation. While we were sitting on the sidelines, we would talk with different kids, and we got to befriend this gang. And a lot of other kids were kind of afraid of them, but we were able to talk with them. And while we're sitting there on the sidelines, one time one of them says, "You guys are Jehovah's Witnesses, right?" And we're like, "No, we're not Jehovah's Witnesses. We believe different things." They were like, "Well, what's the difference?" So they started asking, and they were like, "Okay, so where do you think you go when you die?" And so we get right into a heaven discussion right away in the gospel.
Wow.
And so, but that opened up a lot of doors. And then we did this tournament, and we had about 100 kids show up at this, and Danny and his gang showed up. much to the dismay of some of the other kids, because there was a little bit of that fear of this gang. But they were engaged throughout the whole thing. And I remember, so the tournament was Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And on Thursday afternoon, I told Danny, I was like, listen, are you coming back tomorrow? Because we've got the award ceremony at the end, and we were going to share the gospel at that time, and we were going to give away prizes, all this other stuff. And Danny said, I can't go back. I can't come back tomorrow. It's Friday. And I was like, he was like, I got to work. And I was like, well, ask your boss if you can get off. And he was like, it's not that type of work. And I said, well, listen, if you do that, if you go that way, you know you're going to end up either dead or you're going to end up in jail. And he said, he was like, well, I can't get out. I don't know how to get out. And I remember, and I was like, well, I said, Jesus can help you get out. You know, that's what we're talking about here. He can actually help you get out of the lifestyle that you feel trapped in. And so he said, well, you know, he mumbled something, and then he left. But the next day, his whole gang was there. And they were a part of the tournament. They all watched the final. And then we went into this auditorium, and it was packed. I mean, you had parents who were there. You had girlfriends of the guys who were playing. You had just a big brawl in this auditorium of this school where we were having the tournament. And, you know, all throughout the tournament, we're giving out prizes, and there's whistling, there's jokes being made, you know, people not being quiet and all that. And then I get up and I share the gospel, and it was dead quiet. Like nobody spoke. And I shared the gospel. I did what I just did on another episode that we did about the good news, the bad news and good news, and the gospel. Went through that. And then I said, is there anybody here who wants to pray right now and accept Christ? And I waited, and nobody raised a hand, but it was still super, super quiet. So I said, okay, well, I'm going to pray. And if you want to pray right where you're at, you don't have to raise your hand. You don't have to say it out loud, but you can pray in your heart, and God will hear you. And so we prayed, and then when I was done, I said, you know, thank you for being, you know, but right when I was finished, I finished, I said, amen. Everybody clapped. Everybody clapped. I asked, you know, did anybody pray with me? And nobody said anything still. And so I don't know. I really don't know if anybody did. I have to believe in a room that size, with as quiet as everybody was and respectful, I think there had to have been people who trusted Christ. But for me, those memories will always be amazing memories of God being at work. And that's why I tell people all the time, I'm like, listen, the mission of God, if you get involved in it, it is exhilarating. Anytime I've seen people do that and they get involved in a mission trip or sharing the gospel or a Bible study, and they see life change and they see how God is working through them, it invigorates people. And I think that's when people start latching on. They realize, man, the mission of God is not an option. It is the thing. Yeah. And God is working and using me to do amazing things.
Yeah. So. Wow. Great stories. I love it. I'm sure there's so much more that you could share if we had time. But just kind of to conclude and to wrap this up, what would you give as any sort of advice to people stepping into missionary life, or maybe people who just have friends who are missionaries and want to know how best to support people who are going?
Yeah, I really believe that for some of the people listening right now, any talk about missions, discipleship, evangelism is just another topic for them, or it's a different topic. It's not really something that they're passionate about. And I would say, It is the thing. It is, if you get involved in that, that is what the Christian life is not meant to be ripped apart from that. There's a lot of people. I just ran into a guy the other day that was talking about the difference between being a disciple and a disciple maker. And I'm like, I don't think there was a distinction that Jesus made. I think they're supposed to be one and the same thing. If you are a disciple of Christ, you should be involved in the mission of God. To not be involved in the mission of God and to not make disciples or even be thinking in that direction isolates you from the heart of God. And if you're isolated from the heart of God, over time, you're going to feel more distant from God, which is what we're seeing in so many different places, and why Christianity is in decline in the West. So many people feel distant from God. They feel like, well, I'm not engaged with God. I don't feel like He's close. And I think part of that is because you're not engaging with what He is passionate about. And so, but when we do engage in that and share the mission of God and look for ways to engage with that, God touches our heart in a new and different way, and a walk that, or a relationship with God that might have felt cold before, all of a sudden feels vibrant, and it fills you up, and it gives you joy that you didn't know you could have, and it gives you purpose that you didn't know existed, etc. So my encouragement, get involved in some way with the discipleship movement of God around the world and in global missions as well. It's on God's heart, and I think He wants it on all of our hearts as well.
Yeah.
So
good word. I love it. All right. If you have any other questions that you would love to just hear more stories or more things that you want to know about what it looks like to live life in the mission field, if you'll just leave those in the comments, we would love to chat more about that. This was a great conversation. I loved it. Thank you guys for joining us, and we will see you next time.
See you next time.